Welcome to the State of Play with myself, the Light Broadcaster, bringing you a series of interviews with radical thinkers who have solutions to the rapidly breaking down of old systems and ways of being that no longer serve us, but also providing us with solutions that can positively affect our nation and planet today. I would like to welcome Alex Thompson, geopolitical writer and contributor for UK Column, former British intelligence officer with GCHQ, and all-round good egg. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Angela. It's great to be on.
So, Alex, thank you for coming on to the show. With your amazing and extensive knowledge and background in this area of history of our nation, that is a particular gift that you bring, and I thought it would be a really good idea to share what the state of play is in our country and give listeners an idea of where we have come from as a nation. So there's something that feeds through this, and we were going to start talking about the establishment, because a lot of people don't actually know what that is.
Well, you won't find the establishment gathered in any conclave or room, and you could say that the establishment is more of a concept or a meme than it is a cabal of individuals. Actually, speaking of the word cabal, that word was invented in the 17th century, which we're going to come on to, a crucial time of conspiracy and intrigue in British history, but also of progress. But cabal was invented then to denote a group of chaps sitting around a table carving up the market and carving up politics. But no, behind that, there is a meme, a concept of the establishment, which is we are the people who ought to rule. And I'm afraid that notion and that evil is always going to be with us, and we're just going to have to stay alert to it.
I mean, for me personally, it's an outdated concept.
Very much so. It's a very old-fashioned word. We've probably got overseas listeners as well, or foreign listeners who've come to live in Britain, and they're maybe not quite sure what the establishment is, because in many languages, certainly here on the continent where I live now, people will just use the English word establishment when they're describing the phenomenon, and often they're referring to the British establishment. And they may have a hazy idea, a bit like a British child growing up. So as a child, I came across the word establishment, and I started asking my parents, what was this majestic and wonderful thing that I kept hearing about in hushed tones? Not that we were an establishment family, but, you know, if you listen to the BBC and go to a traditional school, as I did, then you'll hear it all the time. And, okay, my parents tried to explain that to me, and they were talking about redoubtable individuals and powerful connections. And I just assumed from what they were telling me that they were talking about institutions. And I think foreigners as well often assume this, that the British establishment is a group or met in a room. But no, what they were getting at, and I think only a mature thinker realizes what they're really talking about, is they were talking about connections between individuals. And beyond that, or behind that, you've got the idea that you have inherited from your predecessors a means of controlling and ruling and subverting what should be a system and a nation that works for all of us. But that sounds a bit like a political slogan, works for all of us. It's not meant to be party political.
That's fine, even though I saw that you voted Lib Dem.
Yes, I did, out of frustration with the Tories, simply because I'm an inherently conservative and Christian person, but I won't vote for the party that calls itself conservative and unionist, because it's neither of those things, and we need them out. We certainly need to block them from having a supermajority.
So the establishment figures, who are these people? What sorts of people are they?
Well, they're not in politics, largely. Politicians are puppets. This is a necessity in a country which has apparently gone democratic, where people supposedly choose their rulers. Especially now we have universal suffrage. The people who've controlled the nation and the world for centuries before we went democratic can't just give up their power overnight simply because of the ballot box. So usually the establishment lingers in institutions to which politicians have to turn for their approval, and without whom they cannot continue to rule. So I'm talking about the universities, the banks, the churches to a large measure. You'd be surprised how much the churches, and even the Church of England, which seems to be very weak and secular these days, has a strong influence on British politics. And even in the nations outside England, in the UK, the Church of England has quite a lot to say. Generally, I'd say that you're looking for networks of individuals who are linked by common purpose, and I'm deliberately using that phrase because we have an institution now, a political charity called Common Purpose, which has deliberately set out to be the new elite. We could talk about that another time, but it's basically a replacement of the old-fashioned Freemasons, but with far worse intentions than the old Freemasons, most of whom just want to do good. And it's also a kind of replica of the American system of fraternities at universities, so lifelong blood-curdling oaths, as it were, but Common Purpose dispenses with the oaths and just brings people into corrupt leadership. So you've got all that kind of networking going on, and below that, or beneath that, you've got bloodlines, and that sounds a bit David Icke, and I agree with some of what David Icke says, and I respect him a lot for his dogged perseverance. But even if you look beyond the bloodlines, you can have a meritocracy that is an establishment, because people select those who are like themselves. So even in a meritocratic modern Britain run by apparently a transparent civil service and public institutions, you can still have an institution because people like us select people like us to succeed them in post and to be quickly promoted. So you've got commercial ties as well as bloodlines. You can have a monarchic establishment, but you can also have a republican establishment. What ties it all together, I think, is common creeds and a kind of shared moral sense, even a shared complicity. You know, that if we go down, we all go down together. So that's why you've got groups of people who are not the most obvious faces in politics, but they are really controlling the country. They are more loyal to their own class of people abroad or their own predecessors and successors than they are to the people in whose name they rule.
So these bloodlines, I know that David Icke does extensively talk about reptilian bloodlines and archons and various things like that. But in human form, what do you feel about that? Do you think that there are these different bloodlines that have tried to keep themselves pure and in control and keep certain family traits within that line?
Definitely. I mean, even mainstream historians have talked about some of the most notorious bloodlines, like the Habsburgs, who obviously have the shared physiognomy, the prominent nose and the inbreeding. Of course, the whole history of the 20th century is that these bloodlines in continental Europe were thrown off. Most empires became republics after a lot of bloodletting, but they're still at it. The Habsburgs, Otto, for example, who died a few years ago, became an MEP in Austria, and he clearly, for decades, tried to underline the fact that he was not trying to be the Kaiser anymore in Vienna. No, he wanted to be the restored Holy Roman Emperor, basically. And a lot of these bloodlines are just biding their time in various religious and philosophical systems. And they're in fairly prominent positions in the kind of helper institutions I mentioned, like the banks. And they're biding their time for, you could say in some religious ideologies, for the beast to emerge, and then they'll have, their attitude is, then our natural supremacy and our know-how in how to rule will be indispensable, and the people will turn to us again. You know? Here, I live in the Netherlands now, and the House of Orange is the royal family here. All the spares, you know how royals have an heir and a spare, well, they have spare sons. One of them's died here, actually, Prince Friso, but the other spare son is still there, but both of them went off into banking type jobs because that's their natural milieu if they're not the face, if they're not governing.
Wow. So it's the financial backing of the establishment with a general set of rules to try and keep everybody singing from the same hymn sheet, I guess. And
that's it.
Read their creed, yes.
The creed is, it transcends any religion or philosophy that you'd ordinarily meet. At the sharp end, and there's a minority of the establishment that think this way, it is Luciferianism. That's distinct from common or garden Satanism. I accept, although I'm vigorously opposed to it as a committed Christian, I do accept that there's a few people who would call themselves Satanists who have, in modern times, reinvented ancient Satanism, and it has a lot of old-fashioned paganism in it as well. But distinct from that is bloodline belief, Luciferianism, which is believing that Satan, appearing as the angel of light, Lucifer, as he was in his pristine state, is someone worth worshipping, and that if you create havoc and destruction, then it's all going to be worth it in the end, because Lucifer will appear in all his beauty and will return to the primeval golden age, the Saturnine age. That's deep in there in a lot of these establishment families. It's not spoken about openly, of course.
Yeah, right. Well, I think that, it's a very underground kind of scenario where you wouldn't really want to make that kind of thing public if you were that way inclined.
No, and people can feign their religions as well.
Yeah.
You've got people who are crypto Christians or crypto Jews who are in fact Luciferians. Some even who are Muslims, although that's more difficult, of course, because Islam is a lot less tolerant of that kind of Satanism in its ranks.
Mm-mm. So the underpinning thing with this, so we've got religion taking a forward position there. That's been in various forms. I know that you mentioned symbols, the use of symbols in the early stages of this Luciferianism. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, the use of symbols, of course, is uniquely human. There's no other animal, however intelligent, that uses symbols. And as an intelligent lay reader, you can gain quite an impression these days of how humanity learnt to use symbols. If you know which authors to look at, you should look particularly at the retired Cambridge academic Colin Renfrew, Renfrew,
Yeah.
particularly his book simply called Prehistory, which summarises his colleagues' life work in anthropology. And what we know from that, and you can find out a lot more these days on YouTube, you use discretion, but there is a lot out there, is that there was a watershed moment in human history where we had formed as a species. So we had our brains, but we didn't quite know what to do with them yet. And from that point on, an elite started forming, which was more adept in the use of symbols. Think of crossing a border these days. You see a symbol of a chap wearing a peaked cap, don't you? And that says, authority is here. And if you don't speak the language and don't know the political system of the country you're entering or leaving, you still see from the peaked cap that this is someone you need to stop and show your documents to and open your bags for. And that is really what Renfrew is getting at in his book Prehistory, summarising a whole body of work through the 20th century. What archaeology and anthropology tells us is that there came a time in human development in the late Paleolithic, sometimes called the Epi-Paleolithic, the transition to the Meso and Neolithic times, so the end of the Old Stone Age, basically, where we suddenly thought, hang on, we can actually organise in societies. This is even before we started farming. If we give our authority to certain people who wear special garments and use special clothes and use special abracadabra words, then we're going to be able to entrust the planning side of our life to them, and we can get on with our everyday lives. So that's where the idea comes from, of symbols being intertwined with the elites. Obviously, the well-known ones are the pyramid, the all-seeing eye, and various shapes. Some of them relate to the establishment's own mythology, that there was a great golden age in the past when the gods, so-called, which I would contend is Lucifer, but masquerading as God, the gods ruled immediately without interference. And then that's where you get the layers from. So the demiurge, as it were, that Lucifer masquerading as God gives his authority to archons, archontes in Greek, meaning rulers. And these are humans with some godly characteristics because they've been imbued with that authority to rule. So in other words, the establishment from the beginning thought, well, if we use the symbols right, then we will enjoy the confidence of the people over whom we're ruling, and they will think we're ruling on behalf of them. But in fact, we're not ruling looking down, but we're ruling looking up to the, what should we say, demonic powers on whose behalf we rule. It's all a level of fiefdoms, and everyone in it is accountable to the levels further up and is fearful of those further up in the chain.
Yeah. Yep, I can see that quite clearly. I feel that quite clearly. So,
I've seen it inside. You work at GCHQ for 8 years, as I did, or a lot longer. Some of my old colleagues, they're still there. You can have a whole career rubbing shoulders with nothing but brilliant, committed, patriotic people who have proved themselves time and time again as well-meaning and loyal to the Queen and the country, and yet you keep rubbing up at odd moments against people inside or on the fringes of the system, or ex-officers who are controlling things a different way, and you find out that there's a small group of people who, with a nod and a wink, actually steer things. It's the same throughout the military and public service.
So are we flooded with Freemasonry and Freemasonry type groups within that weave?
Yes, Freemasonry itself is simply an artifact of the problem. If you destroy Freemasonry, and I don't suggest anyone does because it's not a solution to use violence, but if you were to suppress Freemasonry, you would not solve the problem. I mean, just to keep it local, in Cheltenham, where GCHQ is based, there is a Freemasons Lodge, and a lot of GCHQ officers are members, but that doesn't have any direct bearing, as far as I can see, on what goes on. No, the problem is that the secret society idea, and you don't even have to be a member of one of them, just the idea of belonging to a fraternity. Common purpose is arguably just the same, without any initiation rites or religious mumbo-jumbo attached to it. That supersedes, that pervades public service. Wherever there's power, people are attracted to network like that. And if people are prepared to sell their soul to the devil, to use old-fashioned language, then they're going to do it. Yeah. So the idea of Freemasonry is an early modern reaction to the increasing progress of humanity. We had democracy and we had sovereignty, and supposedly the people now have governments who rule in their own interests. So what's the response to that? You have to retrench if you're an establishment elitist, and you have to go back to pre-modern models of how to control the people without them knowing it.
Wow. So the people in this country are being controlled without even being aware of it.
But some of the families who are doing that are the same for centuries. We had when James the Sixth of Scotland came down to England, and his son was Charles, who had his head chopped off. James the Sixth became James the First in England. A lot of the advisors who were around him at that time are the same families who were advising the Crown in the late Victorian period, the Cecil family, for example. And they were always interested in provoking foreign wars and enjoying trade benefits for themselves and their own chums as a result of the wars which they fought. And then you get hangers-on like bankers who think, well, if we have a general war, then there's going to be a taxation commitment to spending a lot of money on armaments. So get in there with the companies which produce these armaments. So that's one side of it, and there's much concentration on that these days. But behind that is the thinking. There's a few at the top. I'm not suggesting the Cecil family are that themselves. A few who actually are committed to Lucifer and destruction, and they enjoy death and suffering for its own sake. But most are along for the ride, and because their family don't excel in anything else. You see a lot of this at boarding school, public school where I was. I wasn't one of the native families, but I got there with a scholarship. And a lot of the talk among the boys there is, our family's always been involved in shafting the common man. We don't know how to excel at anything else.
That doesn't surprise me at all. It's this air of entitlement, air of expectation. You can, we've got a huge private school in our local area. So you've got all sorts of people going there. You do hear some horror stories.
Yes.
I'm sure that all the children are supported well in their education. And then so you see some of these older, like A-level students possibly there around, and it's the way that they view children from the local comprehensive school. You can see it in working motion, and it's kind of like, okay, so you can afford a suit like that, but that child over there is struggling to wear a pair of shoes without holes, so it's just, it's quite obvious that this
attitude doesn't go away when young men grow up, and I'm afraid the girls are even worse. As you've probably seen, the private school girls. Cheltenham Ladies' College is a fine example. You ought to hear the taxi drivers' stories about picking the girls up at the beginning and end of term from the station, and the entitlement they display is even worse. But this attitude doesn't go away. If you spent your teenage years at a boarding school they even had a name for it at my boarding school, going Kev bashing. The Kevs being the local comprehensive pupils.
Yeah.
Then if you go around in droves with hockey sticks looking for Kevs to bash, well, that doesn't dissipate when you turn 18 and go to Oxbridge or wherever. These days they can't get into Oxbridge; they're not clever enough, and so they go to other universities like Exeter instead. Yeah. But after that, when you enter the city or whatever you do afterwards, become a private banker. If you're an archetypal public schoolboy with no other skills, then obviously the attitude that you had to the locals or the common man is the same as it was before. They're cattle. And this is an establishment attitude which has been with us since the dawn of farming 12,000 years ago.
So let's just go back to this 12,000 years ago point where the farming of the cattle began.
Yes.
Or the cattle class emerged. What is it there. So we have the use of symbols. The elite families started to. Where do these elite families originate from?
They were just, when we were still in warrior bands or hunter-gatherer bands, and archaeology and anthropology is not my core skill, by the way, it's more language and history, so I'm speaking here as an informed amateur, but you can look this up for yourself. Each band thought, well, our strongest, likeliest looking chap is going to have to speak for us, but then there were wily characters around this chap who became advisors and who used dark arts, basically. Mm-hmm. Even if it was just their own brains initially, they soon fulfilled, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy, they fulfilled the role of nefarious advisor. And they gained power. They had the know-how, and they didn't let anyone know what that know-how was. Of course, they kept it to their own children or to like-minded people in other tribes. And soon you had networks. That's where it came from. We had urbanization about that point. And it's clear that we had an advanced history before 12,000 years ago. This is difficult for people in some traditions, including me as a biblically committed Christian. The Bible does not actually teach young Earth creationism. It is silent about what happened before the time of Adam because it's not relevant to us, at least not in a spiritual sense. So it's not in the Bible. But if you're looking at what we've gained, the knowledge we've gained in the last few decades, it's clear to us now, although it's being suppressed by mainstream science, that there was a global culture that was advanced in navigation, in architecture. Some people argue they had spiritual help from other realms or other beings or whatever. That says maybe. But there was clearly an advanced culture whose maps, this is the crucial link really, the maps of the world, including an accurate depiction of the coast of Antarctica and whatnot, they were preserved until the Middle Ages. The most famous of these maps is the Piri-Reis map, R-E-I-S, and the first word is P-I-R-I. And some people, and I'm not suggesting the Roman Catholic Church is an institution here, but the Vatican Library is involved, people in certain orders and secret societies kept hold of these maps through the time when those cartographers were struggling to chart the coast of Asia and supposedly discovering America. There was a bunch of people who knew all along that the Americas and even Antarctica had been peopled centuries and millennia before that. So there's clearly been hidden knowledge.
Yeah, hidden, yes. So if we take that, that energetic there, and it's a whole energetic that begins to seep into the brain. So you said that humans weren't quite ready. Do you remember that? Humans weren't quite ready to know what to do with their brain, with their experience, and allow themselves to be taken over. What do you... Because there's an element here of interference, I feel, at that point in time in history. Yes. And it may be external from this Luciferian, or this dark force, I will call it, rather than give it a name.
Yes. Well, ultimately, to bear in mind that the Creator is in control, and there is a lot of skill in the Creator to allow us to mature as a species and as individuals, and to allow us to be tamed by the enemy. See, so there was a great deal of potential that was put into humanity in our brain and spirit, and as I say, we were at a level physically, mentally, to cope with modern challenges, even quite a long time ago. Maybe 12,000 years ago or before. But we were not ready to face up to the reality of evil. We hadn't really seen it in its full extent yet. So evil was permitted to come and make compact with some of our leaders, so that we would begin to understand through our own suffering and frustrations that we were capable of being deceived, and we were not quite as almighty as we thought we were, even though we have excellent brains and spirits.
Yeah, humans were not infallible on any level, it seems. So taking that energetic forward, United Nations, that was I know we're slightly going off track here, but I thought it might be easy to do. The United Nations was set up by Luciferianists. Is that right? From the early days.
There's some extremely questionable people involved in the setting up of the United Nations. If you look into when it was set up, it was not actually set up in either New York or London or any of the Allied capitals. It was set up in a hastily cobbled together meeting in San Francisco for which there was no diplomatic authority. And it wasn't even the Allies or the Allied militaries and diplomats getting together. It was a small group of globalists behind them. And in fact, the UN Charter, to give the best example, was written by none other than Olger Hiss, Alger, surname Hiss. And if that name's vaguely familiar to people, it's because he later turned out to be a spy for the Soviet Union and served time, actually, because he'd lied under oath about being a member of the Communist Party.
Mm. So the United Nations Agenda 21 is the same as Common Purpose, pretty much, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, they would deny all linkage, but if you look at the documents which are in the public domain even, they're committed to the same idea. And this is the old elite idea, going back, as I say, 12,000 years, of population reduction. If you're farming cattle, then you don't want your stock to become too numerous. That's as unprofitable as having too few of them, isn't it? Yeah. So there's been a long tradition, particularly in Asia, where the art of government has always been at its darkest and most advanced. There's been a long tradition of culling the people when they get too numerous or too braying. And that's ultimately what the UN model is about. And Common Purpose and our governments, if you look at departments like the Department for International Development, which has mushroomed in my time in government and afterwards, they are openly committed to these so-called goals, sustainability and CO2 reduction. These are all cover terms for fewer people.
We were just talking about the UN having been set up by Luciferianists. Yes. And there's a certain energy there that they want to control the mass population, reduce it, reduce the cattle stock. That's what we were talking about. So let's fast forward there to, say, Iron Age.
Yes. Well, the Iron Age was actually an example of humanity going backwards because of technology. And that might sound counterintuitive, but technology is not always our friend. Just think of the Luddites and smashing the machines in Victorian England, although I wouldn't recommend that either. This has been seen in human history. We moved out of the New Stone Age when we were farming communities and already being subject to elite control as never before, and being treated like livestock and being ordered to have a certain number of children to stay rooted to the spot, basically served them. And having our food rationed and having jobs allocated by the state and work quotas, all this came about at the end of the New Stone Age, the later Stone Age. But then after that, we had a kind of renaissance in the Bronze Age, which was a time of high culture. People had leisure again, and they were able to concentrate on building their families and their assets, and they had time to develop religious ideas. And this was really a process that culminated in the Iron Age. Unfortunately, there's many cycles in human history where the rise of a certain technology, particularly weapons technology, allows governments and elites within governments to regain the upper hand. And one of those was the Iron Age, which began about 1300 or 1200 BC in Europe, at least the Mediterranean basin. And the elite started using this technology, and this happened later when the Iron Age reached West Africa, for example. It caused huge flight of people into southern Africa, the mountain peoples, because of the tyranny that was involved, and the same in Asia. The Iron Age involved a kind of coming of the Dark Ages. Several centuries are lost in Greek history, for example, because of this Iron Age, and then we see Homer and the epics emerging from that period. You have basically a class of technocrats using the centrality of the state, which comes about in the Iron Age, to tyrannize people, to insist on absolute. Before this, we know from the Amarna letters now, a cache of letters found in the Near East, which is a diplomatic correspondence, basically. We know that there was advanced peaceful negotiation between peoples, and that there was a higher understanding of sovereignty and liberty at the end of the Bronze Age. But the Iron Age destroys all this. There are mass movements of peoples brought about by elite manipulation all over the Mediterranean. Sound familiar? This all happened before. And you can see this described in the Bible in miniature as well. If you look at 1 Samuel chapter 13, there's a passage there describing how the Philistines, a Greek people and the very elitist people who settled in Israel, guarded jealously the technology of iron and forced the surrounding peoples to come to the Philistines to make iron weapons. So you've got the same ideas as today. Certain tame states who are in the pay of the elitists have the most advanced technology and license it to rulers in the rest of the world on a carefully guarded process of licensing, basically.
Yeah. So, oh gosh, it's quite tiring when you think about what this nation has actually walked through, because it's we when we get an idea of our true history, then we have an idea of what we are as a nation, as an individual, what we've had to come through. Because whatever our ancestors have experienced, we are the result of that. So I guess it's kind of like in this time of change where people want to live in a different way. They don't want to be controlled. They don't want to be forced into war. They don't want to hurt children. They don't want to hurt other people or anybody or damage anything. It's a very kind of separate way of life that most people want to live by, as opposed to this strata of establishment living and their expectations.
Yes, our forefathers came to these islands because they were seeking liberty and isolation from the evil in the rest of the world. And whether you take a historic or a religious or a pagan attitude to these things, it's clear from any group of sources that, and also just from logic, that people strike out from a large continent to a group of islands because they wish to be left alone in peace. And that's always been the nature of the various peoples living in our islands, is that they want minimal government and they want to be left alone. And they want to enjoy nature and their own family life to the maximum extent. And so there's always been a hard attack by elites on our peoples because they are gifted and insightful and peace-loving and very suspicious of central and overbearing government. And that's been the case whatever religious and political system has been laid on top of us. So there's always been a particular concentration on undermining the people of the British Isles, definitely.
Right, so on to the classical age.
Well, the classical age, of course, is where we get our ideas of politics and government from. And it was actually one of the better periods because you'd had these tyrannical systems. I'm sorry to say they arose at the same time as monotheism, but they were also challenged by the monotheist religions, the kind of tyrannies that arose. By the classical age, you had got a kind of the governing people leisure, philosophizing, and many of them started seeking out the truth around, but basically you could have a comfortable life in many circumstances, and people were happy with their lot, and they spent more time thinking again. Because of the increasing trade and the new technologies, the ships which were being developed, people started travelling more to the east. This was after the Crusades, of course, so at least after the dust had settled from the hot wars of the Crusades, there were re-emerging links with the Arab world and the old Byzantine Empire. What happened was, especially from Italy, which is kind of Europe's springboard to the Levant, the Middle East, a lot of ideas started being imported from that very ancient cradle of civilization, the Near East, which goes all the way back to Sumer, and ultimately the Persian and Chinese way of government as well had started seeping in to the Levant. And so these Italian noblemen who started the Renaissance and who were Europe's brain boxes, really, the most advanced thinkers of Europe, okay, they gave us a lot of good. They gave us modern accounting from Florence in that time. They gave us Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, which is a much maligned book, which actually basically says, this is the reality of having to govern people. But also, they developed a lot of bad ideas, imported and direct from Asia. And the shorthand which is given to this by some historians is the Venetian nobility idea, also known as the Black nobility. And one of the families, actually, which was striving for hegemony in northern Italy at that time was the family of the Guelphs, which is just an Italianization of the Germanic word wolf. So that gives you an idea of what that clan was all about, wolf-like power. And Guelph is actually a name which you'll find in Canada as a place name because it's been preserved through the lines of nobility. And in fact, the current royal family of Britain has a lot of Guelph blood in it.
Guelph, wow. So the blood of the wolf, that just sounds quite archaic in itself in that bloodline. Wow, it really resonates like that. It
Yes. Well,
feels like
the
that.
wolfishness involved in it is that it's a line that goes all the way back to ancient Tyre. And I'm not just making this up. And there's people involved in the system like Lord Glassman, Maurice Glassman, a major thinker on the right wing of the Labour Party, who reels this off. If you look up a documentary made by some Spaniards about the history of the City of London, about 10 minutes into it, he reels off in reverse chronological order all the cities where this Venetian thinking was headquartered, the idea of controlling the people through controlling the money supply and the means of government and advising the crowns of countries. And Venice is, okay, that was its entry point into Europe, but it goes beyond that to ancient Greece and ultimately to Carthage and Tyre. So from the Bible onwards, this way of governing is criticised as absolutist and Luciferian. And it's gone on from Venice to go further up into northern Europe, Antwerp, Amsterdam, the City of London, and now Manhattan. Wherever finance and business is in the lead, this way of life settles in it. And the nobles who are involved in that way of life, and not necessarily dukes and the like, but elitists of any kind, even if they're in a business suit, their attitude is we are in the people, but we are not of the people. We rule them by controlling their rulers through the money supply.
Yeah. So that's in effect what we've got today, isn't it? That's exactly what it is.
Yes. The people who control us and who control our politicians, they have to because of the democratic nature of our society. They have to control our politicians. They don't regard either us or the politicians who are their puppets as being of themselves. We are there for them. We're not of them.
So at that point in time, it was the establishment that were accountable for everything that happened.
Yes. And they were held to account. Look at, in Scots history, the Declaration of Arbroath, in English history, Magna Carta. These are all restatements. Sometimes the Crown was forced to sign these in a treaty. Or, if it was a foreign problem, like Venetian bankers and popes in Rome, they were sent declarations saying, you're no longer fit to rule over us. So that was the time when we held people accountable.
Right. And so when did that actually stop?
Well, like all of the previous cycles, it degenerated when people took their eye off the ball and thought that they had been given liberty on a platter and they never had to be vigilant for it ever again. But it's often said, isn't it, that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And by this time in history, people were letting their eye off the ball within 100 years. I can forgive the medieval people for that because as the Middle Ages petered out into the early modern period, there was huge amounts of death on every hand. All the four horsemen of the apocalypse were present in Europe.
Yeah.
Dying left, right, and centre. So obviously, the relationship between people and governors was different by the time you get on to the early modern period. But then you've got religious complications too, dividing Europe. The Reformation, I think, was absolutely necessary, but it's ended up dividing people and giving them the sense that if you were on the right side of Christianity, the right denomination, then obviously you had to put total trust in your rulers because of the threat posed by other parts of Christendom. You see. Yeah. So with that in mind, both the Catholic monarchs and the so-called Protestant monarchs in the Tudor and Stuart period started saying, well, we can basically rule absolutely. We have a divine right to rule you.
Yeah.
And at this time, of course, some legal minds started writing and cautioning against this and saying, actually, you don't have an unlimited right to rule. We have vested you with power as the Crown in our own interests, and we can depose you if you don't rule properly. But this was a minority view. People started to be locked up in prison, which was unheard of in previous European or Asian history, really, other than in great despotisms. People were locked up or taken off the streets for the crime of not being quite seemly and unsightly. Whole categories of people started being controlled and incarcerated. Terrorism of many kinds was on the rise around 1600. They were banished to the lucrative new colonies. The first people who were sent to the southern states of the current US and to the islands like Barbados were white underclass, as they were regarded. Basically slaves, indentured slaves, or captives from the Irish and Scottish wars.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's this spreading of it's like expansion. It's like a business expansion in essence, isn't it? So
yes, the franchise is being spun out.
Yeah, so the commodities there, human capital, financial capital and wealth to be gained through trade and exploitation.
Absolutely.
So that begins
whenever a political step forward is taken, such as several times during the 1600s, 17th century. The flip side is the new people who come in form a cabal. And that's, as I said, the periods from which the word comes is that Stuart period. And they decide that now we have absolute freedom in business and in commerce and also in politics. We're going to use it to serve our own narrow interests.
Mm. So the actual word cabal, do you know the origin of it? Then?
Yes, I can't name the men offhand, but it's an acronym for the surnames of a few chaps who got together in the reign of, if I'm not wrong, Charles I, and who decided that we are the men who control the government, and particularly commerce.
Yeah, it's just quite interesting. The last three letters refer to the dark force energy that has been knocking around on our planet, doing all sorts of wrong things.
Yes, well, vowel, usually with a long vowel, because in the Semitic languages there's an I in the middle, so it is the original sound, which you'll still hear in Arabic. But even if there's not a direct etymological connection from one language to another, the elitists who believe in these kinds of things have a sort of superstitious belief in the magic power of sounds, yes. So I know that a lot of people in various wings of the alternative media are criticised for these flights of fancy, as they're thought of as being, identifying the devil in every word. But for those who are intrigued by the establishment way of thinking, these things do actually matter. They are of importance, even if it's a kind of forced or fake etymology. It's something that gets the juices flowing among elitists.
Yeah, because I suppose it just feeds the ego at the end of the day.
Yes, the idea that, we've got something over them, they don't know what we've planned.
Yeah, and we're going to trick them into using all the linguistic spells possible to trap themselves in that scenario.
Yes. You hear this mentioned all over the place. I was initially sceptical because of my sort of classical conservative Christian upbringing and all the sources I was reading. I thought, well, you can't just have magic and hocus pocus ruling the show. But if you look at things differently from the point of view of someone who's brought up in an elitist family or business or organisation of some kind, then these do actually become the dominant considerations. How can we trick people? How can we pull the wool over their eyes?
Yeah, I mean, one of the actually on a side point that's just come to the forefront of my mind, King James the First.
Yes.
And the book Demonologies.
Yes.
So there's an introduction there of a way of thinking. He's trying to kind of put into words, and there's an energetic stamp, is what I'm saying. So how do you think that affected the direction of where certain laws, ideas came from?
Well, it moved society from public open government to private special interest government. James is a complicated man. Of course, I'm with a Scots father and an English mother. I see him from two sides. The Scots, apart from a few diehard loyalists to the Stuarts, like in the Highlands, have always been very sceptical about Stuart rule, and he was the first of them to come down from Scotland to England and to be the King of Great Britain, because the Stuarts had centuries to prove themselves in Scotland as a venal and notoriously overbearing family. But James brought this to London, and of course London was all in a whirl because Elizabeth had died without heirs. And it looked like this was the great Protestant saviour of England against the continental threat of the Spaniards and the French and so on. But James brought this whole elitist thinking with him. He was head and shoulders the most intelligent king that Britain ever had, but the only one with a set of published works like the one you mentioned, Demonology. But as I mentioned, brains certainly is not the be-all and end-all of governing. And he was, to use a very British phrase, too clever by half. He and his coterie of thinkers did leave, as you say, a very deep stamp on British lawmaking, because they left the attitude that you need to be very cunning and you need to channel the population in certain ways. And they did it under cover of being very learned Christian gentlemen. But if you look at even something as great as the King James Bible, the Authorized Version, which came about because of King James's personal involvement, it's a wonderful monument to the scholarship of the time, and a brilliant Bible translation which millions of people have valued. But even the way in which it came about was a means of basically dividing and ruling between the Puritans and the High Churchmen, with James basically saying the crown is the highest authority in the land, which is something we'd never had before, the idea that the crown actually exists by virtue of its own intellectual brilliance. And if you bring in that model, then you need a certain number of clever chaps, the ones we've been talking about already, to come into the scene and to act as, to use a modern term, special advisors. Who are these men? Who appoints them? How do they get the king's ear? And we're still saddled with that problem. Before King James, government was done publicly in the sense that the courts, the Parliament were open to anyone. Anyone could come in and obviously not speak in Parliament, but observe what was going on. But James himself, personally, as a young man, stopped this. When he came to power as James VI in Scotland in the 1560s, there was actually a holding of the Scots Parliament in Stirling, and it was held at the castle. And James he was a teenager. He was ordered to by his own elitists around him, but he ordered soldiers to stop anyone from approaching the castle to observe the scene. And he actually made the declaration that I declare that this is a free parliament and anyone has access to it. And if you have a problem with that, you have a problem with me. So a very different attitude indeed when it comes in with the Stuart monarchy. And even when the Stuarts were overturned, the attitude stayed.
Attitude, yes. So at that particular point, there were lots more going on. There were a lot more tax. It was like the early formations of taxes, or the I know that taxes have been collected historically for quite some time before, but it just seems to become more of a concrete thing that we, as a people, all had to do and adhere to those laws.
Yes, this came to a head with the ship money controversy of the 1630s. James's son Charles, who obviously had grown up listening to Dad with his great stories of how to control the rabble, was determined to rule without Parliament. And every schoolchild used to know this in Britain. It used to be very well taught, the Civil War. I mean, my grandfather always used to say that you can't understand British history if you haven't studied the 17th century in detail, and that's why it's the one century which is deliberately skipped over in state and private school education these days, and it's not focused on in university much either, except as a kind of alternative view of history. So Charles wanted money basically for wars and because of the bankers controlling him, or the elitists behind them. And he didn't want permission to raise taxes with permission of Parliament. And this is something which we'd laid down even from Magna Carta onwards, from the High Middle Ages, is that you, as the Crown, you need our permission to tax us. Ship money, for example, was used historically to defend the realm against enemies. Particularly, it was levied in coastal counties, fair enough. That's where the money and the ships were. But Charles tried to revive that in the 1630s out of nothing, and ordered every Lord Lieutenant of every county in England to send him this ship money because, he said, my advisors tell me it's an ancient English custom. And, of course, this came to a head with the famous case of Rex versus Hampden, where Oliver St. John, defending one of the Lords Lieutenant who wouldn't give the money, successfully argued that this is not a custom of the English people. There is no money, even in times of war and emergency, that's raised without permission of Parliament. We seem to be back to that position now, that with this emergency legislation coming in, Operation Tempora and the Civil Contingencies Act, which the latter of which hasn't been triggered, but in substance it's already with us. The attitude is that the Prime Minister, on behalf of the Crown, can do anything without consulting Parliament. Well, no, you can't, not even in times of war, and that was fought over very hard. Charles I had his head chopped off, I would say quite rightly, because he deliberately started 2 aggressive wars against his own people.
And I think that there lies the key to why people have not changed over the last 400 to 500 years. There has been no resolution for the people. This stamped on with old ways and old elite thinking and practices, and these special advisors always having a nice word to say in someone's ear, in the right ear.
Yes.
So how has ship money been manipulated today?
Well, it's the concept, isn't it? As I said at the beginning of the interview, the establishment is a meme. It doesn't have its existence in any one family or meeting. It's just a way of thinking. The same with ship money. So we see a direct line from that through to council tax in the modern era. It's declared by the government, sometimes using statutes agreed on in Parliament, but sometimes just using basically decrees. We call them statutory instruments to pull the wool over people's eyes in Britain, but they're basically decrees by the government acting outside Parliament that we're decreed to owe a certain amount of money. Licensing is another one. It goes up from year to year. It was fought very heavily in the 1920s when it started rearing its head again. If you look at the book, Is Administrative Law Lawful? And there's another one, a British version of that called The Modern Tyranny or The New Tyranny. I can't remember the exact title, but it was Mrs. Thatcher's favourite book on by the Master of the Rolls about this practice. There was a reviving of it after the First World War, basically, of the old Stuart attitude of we are going to tell you what you owe and you are going to pay it. But as was argued in the ship money case in the 1630s, that is not lawful. It's flagrantly in breach of the contract, the covenant, the treaty between the people and the Crown, which was put in place by the people for the people's benefit. And we're just not gutsy enough in resisting it. Council tax refuseniks have their day in court and say, where is this money going? And they're never given a satisfactory answer. Okay, we're told that there's a statute that permitted it, but it's not decently and lawfully agreed upon.
So there's a lot of confusion about the type of law that is in operation in the UK today, isn't there? Yes,
and there's a lot of claims that we are, at least in the minds of certain elite people, we are being governed as if we were conquered. So you've got admiralty law is sometimes what people call it, or maritime law, or concepts from it being used. Now, as a interested lay reader of the law, I know that lawyers will scoff at this and say, that there's no basis for this, and there isn't on paper. But we're talking about attitudes here. The same attitude that came into the United States after the Civil War they had in the 1860s. They brought in 4 new amendments, I think it's the 13th to the 16th, which redefined the nature of citizenship. And a lot of people have done deep research on that and found that as a result of that, the post-Civil War population of America was being treated as a conquered subject people being governed under admiralty law. Obviously, that's hard to reconcile with the overt version of history where people have gained their freedom and they have liberty under law in both Britain and America. But if you look at the attitudes of the Crown advisors and key lawyers, then the attitude does seem to have been that the people are to be treated as subjects. You see it in even attitudes like a judge in a Crown court in England getting away with things like directing the jury and saying, "I won't have that in my courtroom." That's how do judges get away with that?
I guess because they're a judge.
Oh, yes. Judicial appointment is often neglected. The Americans elect their judges, which is a far better model, I think. We have, before Tony Blair, we just had barristers being promoted. Well, first of all, to get to the bar was one thing, and then to get to be a QC, a Queen's Counsel, was done basically by selection within the profession, and then some of them were appointed judges. And Blair, in the interests of so-called transparency, but really acting for the elite, decided that a body was going to be appointed called QC appointments. And without being a QC, you never make it to being a judge. So even the means of getting to be a pre-judge level is now set by a body which, as usual, we report on this all the time at UK Column, claims to be independent and transparent and is neither of those things.
Exactly. The key moments in British history, we've been talking about various different ages. What are the key points that stand out for you where individuals in our country have been manipulated? And, apart from all those other times since 12,000 years ago, people, we've really got to have a change here because this is not acceptable in any way, shape or form. We need to move forward. So Alex, what were the key points where you feel that this has happened, this manipulation?
Well, arguably they go all the way back to 1066, but just to focus on the ones which are most dodgy of all, I would say 1213, when King John had bankrupted the crown and he pledged England to the Vatican. These all used to be well-known dates and events in primary school history, but I think probably not now, so I better repeat them.
Yeah.
When Henry VII died in 1509, his son Henry VIII was persuaded by special advisors to reverse his father's policy, which had kept the elite in check, and he was quickly dissuaded from his initial determination to destroy the Venetian plutocrats. That was called the League of Cambrai, the alliance against them. As I mentioned already, James Stuart, when he the 6th of Scotland, when he became the 1st of England in 1603, a key moment. 1649, there seems to have been intrigue from overseas in allowing Charles I to escape captivity so that he could be recaptured and then beheaded. 1660, the Restoration. Who were the gentlemen inviting the Stuarts back? Why? We don't know for certain. Historians are divided. 1666, the Great Fire of London and the Cestui Que Vie Act. I'm just listing these quickly because some of your listeners will know them well and others will perhaps find this a bit too detailed. But to answer the question in one go of key dates. 1688, the Williamite settlement, where it was necessary to get rid of the Stuarts, and we did that year, but when the Dutch stadtholder was invited over to become King William III, he didn't actually repeal and annul all the things that had been abuses under the Stuarts. For example, on the matter of freedom of conscience in worship, he didn't abolish the expectation that you all had to be Anglicans. He said that he would tolerate non-Anglicans. And in the same package of laws, the Williamite settlement, he brought in un-English concepts such as the Mutiny Act, so that if you refused to obey an unconstitutional order, you could be tried for it. Then we had the Union of Parliaments in 1707, a big one for the Scots, of course. Half of Scotland has always claimed that this was a moment of intrigue, and who was acting behind the throne again. A few years after that, Queen Anne died childless, some suggestion that that might not have been entirely natural, and so the Hanoverians took over with a very Prussian attitude of crush the people using military might, and that's been with us ever since. 1803, the Union of the Irish, the Grattan Parliament with the British Parliament. The Crown was very weak in this period through the Regency. The government just got away with what it wanted. Then, of course, and this I think leads you on to your second interview in the series, 1914 and again in 1917, the Crown is broke at the beginning and also towards the end of the war. And so economic people can tell you more about that, but basically the Crown was persuaded to go into debt and to get itself in hock, and to drop the gold standard. And then we get the interests of the Cecils and the Rothschilds coming in, the Balfour Declaration. And then, of course, the hugely important period at the end of the Second World War, 1944 to about 46, 47, when all the international institutions and cabals again were reformed. Bretton Woods, the IMF, the World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, the UN, the Marshall Fund, the Commonwealth. Very, very, very questionable people involved in the setting up of all of them, even if it was in the name of our own dear king, and then from 52 on to our own dear queen. And finally, I would say that the most important and recent intrigue moment for Britain was 1972 with the European Economic Community negotiations. We all know now, most of us know what kind of man Heath was. He was compromised, according to some, since 1939, that he was a German asset. I'm not blaming the people of Germany, but that's where the intrigue was coming from at that moment. So the country was strong-armed and deceived into joining the European Economic Community. And in fact, not all of that was secret. Thanks to the Norwegian press, we know that Heath actually wrote to the Norwegian Prime Minister, because originally Britain, Ireland and Denmark were going to go into the EEC in the same batch as Norway on the 1st of January 73, but the Norwegians pulled out when the Norwegian Prime Minister discovered that he was giving away his fishing rights through cleverly constructed directives. And Heath wrote to him saying, "My dear chummy Prime Minister, we are fellow elitists, aren't we? You will, I'm sure, join with me in deceiving your people and assuring them that they will not lose their fishing waters." And the Norwegian Prime Minister said, "Up yours," and published the letter.
Excellent.
Not that anyone seems to know about that in Britain.
Well, no, it was one of the things that I could never really figure out as a child, age 10, is why we entered into that agreement. And I was even more annoyed because it happened before I was born. So I was kind of pushed into it.
Yeah.
It's like, no, I don't want to live like that, thank you. So Heath has been compromised as a German asset since 1939. How many other asset-style people do we have in operation in the establishment, I wonder?
I think there are hundreds and hundreds of them, and I'm pretty sure I've rubbed shoulders with a few. They tend not to be the number one of a department, but they tend to be the hangers-on, the number two or three, or the head of administrative affairs type position for a government department or an agency. And if you meet them, they treat you coolly and arrogantly and look through you as if you were something the cat dragged in. Yeah. Even if you're the acknowledged expert in the government or in some branch of public service on a particular area, as I was, if you're sent to a meeting to talk about that area, you'll be ignored by a closed group. And some of them, of course, regret being in the cabal. They're kept in by terror, by the threat of having their sexual or financial affairs revealed.
So what happens if the person is a clean living, conscious person and there is nothing to reveal and they can't get one over on them? What happens in that scenario?
Sometimes they will be ridiculed, sometimes assassinated, and as a former intelligence officer, I'm quick to say our intelligence agencies most definitely do not assassinate people, but former and possibly a few serving senior officers of the intelligence services have ways, and likewise former special forces men, of bringing about that executive outcome without the Crown itself getting its fingers dirty. It's called plausible deniability.
Of course.
Sometimes they will be drugged and forced into particular sexual scenarios or financial scenarios. Often they will be offered directorships of corrupt and bogus companies to keep them sweet. That gives them a source of income, a sinecure to go to when they retire from politics or public life, and it also means that there's a stranglehold over them while they're in office.
George Osborne springs to mind.
Not just him either.
No, and a list of a few others there as well. So, thanks there. We've sort of just created a picture of where we've been for the last 12,000 years as a nation, what has happened here. So, is there one law that has always been in operation for the last 1,000 years? I've read extensively about the Magna Carta from a range of sources, from the way that it's explained to children to actually trying to read the document itself with reading glasses. So what is it, a constitution? Is it a British constitution?
There is a written British constitution. We're told from on high that there isn't such a thing. But if you start challenging that claim, you'll quickly be told you're a loony, and people will not listen to what you're saying because they've made their minds up that it's in their interests that Britain shouldn't have a written constitution. But we do. And the key thing that makes a document a constitutional document is not its being a statute in Parliament, because there's things anterior and superior to Parliament, and these are treaties. The Crown only exists because the people has covenanted with a particular family and individual to reign, and ultimately contracted in God's sight as well. And so the idea of a treaty is that sets the ground, the basic agreements under which statutes can then be enacted. And Parliament itself owes its existence to the fact that Magna Carta says that Parliament should come into being in various clauses hints towards that. And yes, Magna Carta is hard to understand because a lot of it is detail of the 13th century economic way of life, but the principles are overarching. So Magna Carta is one occasion where we forced the Crown, literally, held the Crown hostage to agree the deal. And it was, again, the lords, the barons that did that. We have to have a healthy respect for those at the top of society who are not corrupt. They have the bearing and the breeding and the learning, if they're not corrupt, to do this on behalf of us, and it's what they should be doing. So we can't just be opposed to all of the peers. There's other examples like the Declaration of Arbroath, where the people send a national declaration establishing how they are to be governed and what they will not accept. Again, the key moment in the 17th century, which we were talking about a lot, the Williamite settlement, is the Act of Settlement. I beg your pardon, that's 1707. What I mean is the Bill of Rights. And again, what's crucial there is not the Bill of Rights, or in Scotland, the Claim of Right as a statute. That is simply an enactment of something which was agreed between people and Crown before it went to Parliament, and therefore is superior to Parliament. And in this case, it was a treaty called the Declaration of Right, which states that we have inalienable God-given rights, most of which are flagrantly infringed now by the current government, acting under royal prerogative. So we've had this constant battle to assert, and all the constitutional documents say that they are reassertions by the Lords on behalf of the people of things which were historically accepted before the document itself existed, constantly having to reassert that there's certain things that the Crown, Parliament, government cannot do to us. It undoes its own right to exist as an authority if it does such things. And I'm afraid we just have to keep on reasserting that. And particularly now, we have to look towards the remaining Lords who are faithful, to get some iron in them, to get some fire in their veins again. I know many of them just want a quiet life, and others are fearful or compromised, and others don't want anything to do with it. But they're the people, historically, the barons, who keep reasserting our immunities and privileges.
In 2010, did the barons, did they reactivate or reassert? Is that the correct word?
It was actually 2001.
2001,
that they
sorry.
invoked the relevant article of Magna Carta, and 24 of them are required on Magna Carta to do that. And they did, in fact, inform Her Majesty that they were invoking that article, and they couldn't even do it in person because just like 2 years previously in 99, we had seen the Lords basically abolished under cover of modernisation, and since then the Metropolitan Police wouldn't let the proper peers sit in the House. They weren't given access. So likewise, the barons were told when they fronted up at Buckingham Palace, and you'll get this if you try to deliver a writ to Downing Street. I've seen this personally with the man who is going to be your next interview subject as well. So in this case also, the men attempting to deliver a writ were told, no, you don't have an appointment with the Queen. You'll have to do it in writing. A common trick now, to use soldiers or policemen, again with James I doing it when he was James VI of Scotland at the Scots Parliament, using muscle, often foreign muscle, like the Hanoverians used foreign troops in Britain and America, to keep people from accessing those to whom they can deliver legitimate grievances. But, a writ is not a protest, and a treaty is not a statute. These things actually are God-given entitlements to be able to transact with our rulers in this way.
Right. So, I mean, we've got a lot of change to happen in this country. We really do, in order to raise the bar for the people in it, because it's kind of having historically as a nation gone through all these traumatic incidences, because for me it's about the human impact, what these scenarios have done to the people to make us live in the way that we are now, with total acceptance, and not even, there are some portions of society that aren't even prepared to listen to anything that could be negative about the government, state or establishment. And even though we're going to have to overcome this as a nation, actually, and learn to be more tolerant of these old beliefs, but also we need the new to come through with that, And however that takes form, I hope it's for the good of all. So, Alex, who owns this country, lock, stock and barrel?
On paper, it's the Crown, because the Crown has what the Americans call eminent domain. English and Scots law have different terms for it, but it's ultimate authority over the land, with the exception of the Northern Isles of Scotland, where Udal law still operates. The people have absolute or allodial claim to land in certainly that part of Scotland, arguably all of Scotland. But certainly England, Wales, Northern Ireland, the Crown has no impediment to owning all the land ultimately. We still haven't got to the bottom of whether the Crown is a corporation sole or a corporation aggregate. The mainstream sources tell us it's a corporation sole. In other words, the Queen does what she likes. But there's a lot of historical evidence that it's actually a corporation aggregate. It's the people in compact with the Queen that form the Crown. So you can't trust the legal advice you seek on this because it's partial and compromised. So ultimately the Crown owns it, but then owning has got several elements to it. Land, well, a couple of dozen families and corporations own a lot of the land. Oxbridge colleges, the Church of England, private investors. If you talk about the valuable land, like the buildings in city centres, mostly foreign investors now, Arabs and Chinese. We've cash-gutted ourselves. As an intellectual consideration, who owns the country in terms of the patents, the copyright, the intellectual property that is so necessary to our prosperity and progress and independence? Well, ultimately, most of that property has been stolen by a criminal syndicate. That's difficult to get into now, but since the Second World War, the English-speaking world has seen patents stolen, basically, from their inventors and from the public ownership as well. And in owning in terms of government as a machinery and a policy-making apparatus, well, again, a cabal owns the country. It's a neocon outfit, to use one of the terms for it. A third way ideology is another way, neither left nor right. Or there's many definitions of what third way is, some of which are demonic, and I think they all tie together. The people involved in the thinking of third way want us to be tyrannized within freedom, basically, neither tyranny nor democracy, but somewhere in between. So there's heavy doses of control mechanisms in there. Ultimately, one of them is Zionism. Yes, I'm not afraid to say so, but it's not Zionism as in headquartered in Tel Aviv. It's Zionism as a mindset among certain Luciferians.
As their way of being. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Ways of being is absolutely a key phrase in this. Absolutely, it is. And ultimately, there's one more answer to your question, who owns the country? If you think of it in terms of way of being, what's our spiritual striving, what's our intellectual existence as a nation? Well, we're owned by bankrupt ideologies, particularly Anglicanism and political correctness, both of which appear on paper to be completely opposed to each other. Anglicanism is supposed to be biblical Christianity, and political correctness is supposed to be pure Marxism. But strangely, they seem to meet in the middle somewhere, don't they? And in the nefarious network or blob around common purpose, they seem to have total agreement about the kind of society they want to see, with bishops actually sitting on the boards of common purpose.
Okay, so Alex Thompson, with all your experience, knowledge and research, what do you feel the state of play is in Britain today?
W.B. Yeats said it well in The Second Coming. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And Shakespeare said something similar in Julius Caesar. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. In other words, to do good and to assert common law, God-given rights, the limitation of the powers of the government, our freedom to have our own way of life, that is something we constantly need to be doing vigorously, particularly when things seem to be going well. But human nature being what it is, we tend to go to sleep and focus on our own narrow existence and material comfort. And that's what allows elitism to keep creeping back in. And so we've got to the bottom of another one of these cycles. We're in the trough now. And I have confidence in God and in our people that we're going to reassert in a lawful and successful manner our own God-given rights. In many ways, the country feels burned out. And when I pop back to Britain on brief visits, I can sense the depression and the stasis, the inertia that there is. We seem to be lacking any of our historical drive to do the right thing. But, if we think about the darkest hours of our past, I'm not talking about foreign enemies, which we have had, but when we were undermined from within, there was a similar sense of desperation and hopelessness and material self-serving going on in the country at that time. And suddenly a spark reignited the passion of all classes of society and all regions of the country to do the right thing. And I think that that's going to happen again. But at the moment, the state of play is the darkest hour before dawn.
Right. Well, that's a really key point for people to realise, because we are at that point. We need to live in a better way for all our future generations. So, Alex, what are your solutions to ending historical coercion that weaves its way through our culture today?
First of all, we need to pray, and you may have some religious belief or none, so don't do anything hypocritical, but there's always been a devotion to prayer before we've changed anything in Britain in the past, even if we've gone through the political route to do so. You need to read, inform yourself on what's going on. Don't neglect meeting together. And in fact, in the Christian sense, that's a direct commandment given to people in the book of Hebrews. But it's a very useful thing, whatever your spiritual struggle. Don't give up meeting with like-minded people, even if the opportunities seem to be closing and most people seem indifferent. Keep on meeting, particularly with the dispossessed and the neglected and the marginalised, because they're the ones who have the power and the conviction to do things.
Yeah. Speak
up in your own way of life, whether you're in business or in public life or you're not in paid employment. Make sure you speak up and don't put up with any nonsense. Don't be intimidated. And we British, we're not usually intimidated by muscle or armed men coming onto the streets. That tends to be very counterproductive in Britain. We're mostly intimidated by the sense that good people and nice people don't make a fuss. You know, particularly in Middle England, that's a big problem. The tetching and tutting shuts us up. Don't be shut up. You know, look people in the face if they're acting for the elite interest, and tell them what they are in polite and lawful language. Tell stories. Share the experiences of your own people and your own family. And finally, stare down the really hardcore enemy, the evil men and women in our midst, by having an unnerving confidence. Don't be fazed or rattled by them. Just look them in, even if you don't say anything, look people in the eye when they are acting on behalf of the enemy, and just let them know that you have not been cowed yet.
So people, we need to speak up on all levels from all levels within you, where you feel strongly about a subject. And it's not being angry or aggressive, it's being a bit kind of adult about it and talking things through. Even though that they might not listen if they're from a particular group, just be persistent with your own truth. That's what I would recommend to the listener. So thank you very much for listening to us this day. Thank you, Alex, for your amazing information and helping us to create a picture of why Britain is the way that it is. And let's hopefully take some ideas forward on how we want to live for our future generations. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.